increasingly, military operations are joint operations, which means that multiple forces are involved. Each of the forces, as we will see, has its own doctrine, but there is also joint doctrine, which plays a role above the separate service doctrine. And I built something called the Joint Doctrine Ontology with collaborators of mine here in Buffalo. And this presentation is about that Joint Doctrine Ontology, how it arose, how it relates to the other ontology work that I've been doing, and how it's being used. So you've all seen this. This is the framework called the Oboe Foundry, which is a framework of ontologies for life sciences. So you have an ontology of proteins down here on the left, you have an ontology of biological processes over there on the right, and all of these ontologies are built in such a way that they work together. And the basic formal ontology is the top level ontology, which they all share in drawing their most general terms, which are terms like object, process, and so forth. And the methodology to create all of these other ontologies is that you start by importing BFO into your protege or to your ontology editor, and then you define the most general terms in the relevant domains as children of the corresponding BFO terms. And so we saw how this worked with the cell ontology. All cells are objects, and so the topmost term in the cell ontology is cell, and that is defined as a child of object. Now, this is an overview of Army doctrine, and doctrine is conveyed, crystallized in publications, doctrine publications. And these are not all the doctrine publications, but they are a large fraction of them. So all of the official Army doctrine publications are listed here. So there is Army doctrine publication number 1, which is just called The Army. And then there is Army doctrine publication 3-0, which is Unified Land Operations. Army doctrine publication 2-0, which is Intelligence. Army doctrine publication 3-05, which is called Special Operations, and so forth. And then there are some Army doctrine reference publications, which these are short and very, very focused on fundamental principles, and these contain a lot of detailed information concerning those principles. But they more or less match the corresponding doctrine publications. And then there are field manuals. There are many more field manuals than there are doctrine publications. And field manuals talk not about general principles, and we'll see what some of those general principles are, but they talk about tactics and procedures. So more focused, more concrete. And then even more concrete, there are Army techniques publications, which often have to do with the use of specific weapons or specific weapons types. And you can find them all, they're all in the public domain on the Army publications website, the link to which is down there at the bottom. And so this is a slightly expanded view so that you can see some more of these titles. And then there is the Air Force doctrine. As you can see, they have a different flavor to their doctrine website. The U.S. Air Force doctrine publication number 1, called Volume 1, is called Basic Doctrine. And it has chapters: policy, strategy and doctrine, uses of doctrine, air power, the foundations of air power, and then another chapter, the principles of joint operations, where the Air Force doctrine explains to Air Force people how they should work with other services. And again, there are many other pubs. This is just Volume 1. There's Volume 2, which is on leadership, Volume 3, command, and then annexes to all of these on counter-sea operations, counter-air operations, electronic warfare operations, and so forth. So you get the idea. You have hierarchy with the very general doctrine pubs at the top, and then you get more and more specific ones as you go down. And then we have Navy, which again has a quite different approach to these things. Basically, the Navy does not seem to like the internet very much, so you can't find Navy doctrine easily as you can find Army and Air Force doctrine. But again, you have various publications: naval warfare, naval intelligence, naval logistics, naval planning, and naval command and control, and others. And now I said that all of these things are arranged in a hierarchy. So there is the Army capstone doctrine, which presents the principles applying across the whole Army. And then you have operations doctrine, which is at the next lower level, and all the terms defined here are reused in hubs down here. And then you have further down even more specific ones, and again, all the terms defined up here are reused down here. So there is a logical flow down. What is said up here holds in all of these publications also. And there is a flow down from even higher up, because the Department of Defense, in fact the Secretary of Defense, writes the laws governing doctrine into law. And so there is a US, part of US law which flows down logically into all of this. But now you see that joint doctrine is also playing a role here. So for the Army and indeed for the other services, the joint doctrine is logically precedential. These things are subservient to joint doctrine, and many of them now, this was not always the case, many of them now are just written by copying word for word corresponding doctrines in the joint doctrine publication hierarchy. All right, so it's more complicated because, first of all, there is joint doctrine, and then there is US doctrine, and then there is NATO doctrine. Also, all of these break down into various service doctrines and field manuals. And NATO doctrine is supposed to be logically subservient to joint doctrine, but as you can imagine, that's a very difficult trick to perform, because joint doctrine is created by the US and NATO doctrine is created by multiple governments who might not always agree, or who might agree but they don't negotiate carefully or in detail sufficiently. So the logical relation between joint doctrine and NATO doctrine is much more delicate than the logical relation between US doctrine and joint doctrine. And we won't talk about intelligence doctrine here. A very small part of joint doctrine is classified, but nearly everything in joint doctrine is in the public domain. You can download it very easily, and we'll see the extent of it in a minute. So this is Homeland Security doctrine, this is Joint Cyberspace doctrine, which you can just download. This is Religious Affairs doctrine, so this is a doctrine which explains why we need not only Catholic priests and Muslim personnel, we also need humanist personnel, because not all soldiers are believers. And we have health doctrine and so forth. This is the entire joint doctrine hierarchy. This is like, so you can't see it very clearly, but we have joint doctrine part 1, and then we have the various keystone publications which have to do with personnel, intelligence, operations, logistics, planning, and communication systems. And then we have lower down all of these publications. Each one is a PDF file. You can also buy it as a printed book. They are of the order of 100 pages typically, but some of them are much longer, some of them are shorter. And they are updated regularly, every 3-4 years. They're constantly tested. There's a whole organization within the U.S. military, which is devoted to writing doctrine, testing doctrine in the field, of revising doctrine, and so forth. And then each of the services have their own doctrine group. So that the Army has something called TRADOC, which means Training and Doctrine Command. And this tells you what the most important application of doctrine is. It's training. So these things are created as manuals for training the troops. And also training the officers, who were originally trained in the same sort of way that the troops were trained, at least insofar as the use of terminology is concerned. Now, it's not just training, as we shall see, but the most important application, purpose, goal of doctrine is to provide a uniform body of training in the use of language, as well as in actual operations. So that if a commander issues an order, he will use language in conformance with doctrine, and the troops will have learned the same language and will immediately understand exactly what the commander wants. And if you didn't have doctrine, you would have too much flexibility in what commanders say and in how what they say is interpreted by the people in the field. All right, so there are capstone publications, of which there is only one, Joint Doctrine 1, which is the general principles. And then there are keystone publications. And then at the very top of the hierarchy below here is something called the DoD Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. Now, I've talked in previous sessions about the relationships between ontologies and dictionaries. So dictionaries are written for humans, ontologies are written primarily for computers. Now the DoD dictionary is written for humans. It's a PDF file, it's a printed book, it looks like Webster's dictionary. It's subject to much more control and to many more rules. And I'll give you an example of one such rule. Definitions in the DoD dictionary are not allowed to be circular. Now they don't specify this, but that means that they can't be circular at one remove. So if you define A as a kind of B, and then you define B as a kind of A, or if you define A using the term B and define B using the term A, then that's circular. But it could also be circular at two removes. Mm-hmm. Now, the ordinary dictionaries, Webster's dictionaries, are full of circularity. And that's fine. Humans find circularity helpful for some reason. But computers, of course, can't do anything with circularity. And the people who wrote the rules for doctrine said that all the doctrine terms have to have definitions, and wrote down rules for formulating those definitions, one of which is definitions shall not be circular. But in other respects, it looks like an ordinary dictionary in the sense in which Webster's is an ordinary dictionary. Okay, so now it looks like this. It used to look like this. So very recently, it was no longer called Joint Pub 1-02. For some reason, they decided it would not be a joint pub. And so they created this new presentation, and it's still listed on the joint pub hierarchy, but it's no longer a joint pub with a number. And you can find all of the joint pubs on this website, the Joint Electronic Library, and JEL Plus is the classified pub, which you can't find. And there you can go and get each of the joint pubs as a PDF file. You can get the Joint Dictionary as an Excel file. You can get another Excel file with all the acronyms used in the Joint Dictionary, and you can get the whole thing as an XML file, which is a kind of stepping stone towards RDF and OWL. It's a more elaborate version of HTML. But these things are not really for use by computers for purposes of reasoning. They're more for use to enable access through certain systems to human beings who will see the relevant content that they need to see on a screen. And one of the goals of the creation of the Joint Doctrine Ontology was to enable the computer to use the content of joint doctrine in the same sort of way that computers use the content of biological theories in reasoning about genes or diseases or proteins. All right. Any questions? Yes.
You said one application is training training troops,
Yep.
officers. Are there other applications?
Yeah, we're going to see some of the other applications. Okay. All right, so when we created the Joint Doctrine Ontology, we had to state the goals, and the idea is, first of all, to create a computational counterpart of the DoD dictionary, to test it, and to use the JDO as a vehicle for enabling other Army, Navy, Air Force IT resources to become interoperable with each other. And that's what the paper is all about that I added to the reading for today's class. So the idea is that the military now is becoming increasingly an IT organization. So I think 40% of military personnel now are IT personnel.
Wow.
And if you the amount of investment in IT is a large fraction of the total investment in US military. And it may very well be more than half now. If you think about all the IT in a given aircraft or a ship, for instance, and if you think about the fact that the IT portions are the most expensive portions of an aircraft or a ship, and that all of the personnel that need to be trained, recruited and trained to look after the IT for personnel, for aircraft and ships, you can see that the amount of investment in these sorts of artifacts is considerable. Now the problem is that if the Air Force buys a new kind of aircraft, the aircraft is designed by a company and built by a company, then all of the IT within that aircraft is going to have to be talking to IT on the side of people and of existing computers used by people for planning and intelligence and so forth. And currently, every time a new aircraft or even a new aircraft part is designed, typically it's designed with its own new set of IT codes and its own usages of terminology and so forth. And the result is that every piece of equipment which the military buys costs, let's say, $100 for the hardware, but another $100 to pay for all the IT costs involved in plumbing in that new piece of equipment to all the other pieces of equipment which use IT. And people have said that this is crazy, that we're allowing people to sell us very, very expensive equipment, and then this equipment is costing us twice as much because the equipment comes with IT which does not work with the existing IT that we have already. And so there is a problem. This is called the problem of interoperability. This problem of interoperability often leads to gigantic failures. So the most famous of these failures was the Airbus. The Airbus was designed and built in two places. The front end, I believe, was built in Toulouse in France, and the back end was built in Hamburg in Germany. And they used slightly different software, slightly different CAD software, which is computer-aided design. And the French had an ontology in their CAD software which treated holes with an H as three-dimensional entities. And the Germans used slightly different CAD software which treated holes as two-dimensional entities. There are many holes in an aircraft which have cables running through them. And when they brought the two parts together, they discovered that the cables were just a few millimeters too short. And that cost, 30 billion euros to fix.
So the French were right.
The French were right. I don't want to say anything more about the French. But anyway, the reason for that failure was a failure of interoperability in the software, the IT being used for the two halves of the aeroplane. And there are many other such stories. That was just the most conspicuously ridiculous. Now, so the idea is to advance interoperability across IT resources in just the same sort of way that Joint Doctrine is trying to advance interoperability across the services, so that when commanders from the Navy issue orders to Air Force personnel, then nothing will go wrong because of Joint Doctrine. So we should have something like Joint Doctrine for IT, and the Joint Doctrine Ontology was designed as the first step to bring about Joint Doctrine for IT. And the Joint Doctrine for IT would be somewhat different from Joint Doctrine for the services, in the sense that manufacturers of equipment would be, and IT personnel on the outside, IT contractors would be subjected to it, not just people who are actually in the military. All right, so this is what the Joint Dictionary looks like. So we have intra-theatre airlift, and then a definition of airlift conducted within a theatre, and so on. And then this is what the Joint Doctrine Ontology looks like. So the blue here are terms from either BFO or the Common Core ontologies, which you've heard about, and the green are terms from the Joint Doctrine Ontology. And so this is another largely blue. So I guess let me just get this right. On this diagram, blue means BFO or CCO. On this diagram, blue means actual Joint Doctrine terms. So my color scheme is not very consistent. So you see here the term operation, which is an activity, which is a BFO process. And then operations include stability operations, survivability operations, cyberspace operations, and so forth. And then survivability operations include protection, and then protection includes protection of shipping, protection of forces, and freedom of navigation operations. That's counted as a kind of protection. And this is another one which I won't go through. Again, this is all the operations and the subtypes of operations. But now you see that this is operations underscore number 2. This is operations underscore number 1. And that's because, like Webster's dictionary, so the DoD dictionary very often has one single term with 3 or more or numbered different meanings. And that, of course, is from an ontological point of view not good practice, but right. We have to work with what we have to work with. And so there is a term system, which is defined, and then we have weapon system, space system, theatre event system, and so on. Global positioning system. And you see how the ontology works. So it's not completely translated into ontology form, but I think 80% of the 2,600 or so terms in the Joint Dictionary are in the Joint Doctrine Ontology, and in all their meanings, which means a lot more than just 2,600. All right, so interoperability is defined by the military. It's defined in the DoD instruction, indeed. It's the ability of systems, units, or forces to provide data, information, material, and services, and accept all of those things, and to use them all to enable them to operate effectively together. So interoperability for the DoD isn't just a matter of data or information or IT systems. Interoperability is everything. People have to interoperate with machines. Machines have to interoperate with other machines, and so forth. And then the role of the Joint Doctrine Ontology is, for instance, to provide ontology terms to tag mission network traffic. So the idea is that if you're a group of warfighters, you're in the field, you have a network, you have a server, you have radios, and you have laptops, and you have helmets, all of which are connected to the network. And the network has to perform various roles. It has to be defended, it has to be protected, it has to have a substitute if it goes down, and so forth. Some of those roles are defined in Joint Doctrine. Some of the uses for the network are defined in Joint Doctrine. And so the people building the network have to be familiar with the definitions of the terms which apply to the uses, applications, protection, and so forth of the servers. But the servers, the software running on those servers and on those laptops also has to use those same terms. And so we need some kind of computational version of the definitions of the terms. And that's what the JDO is designed to provide. And this is the paper that I referred to in which all of this is set forth. And now the first problem is that the DoD dictionary is supposed to define all the terms in the joint pubs. But there are many terms which are not defined in the DoD dictionary, but which are used all over the place in the joint pubs. Terms like commander or nation. And there is a rule. So the rule just says use definitions from Webster's dictionary. But it doesn't say which edition, and that could be very important. Moreover, Webster's dictionary typically has many definitions for commander or nation, for instance. And some of those definitions may be inconsistent with the needs of the DoD. Moreover, it could very well be that there are many definitions of a term like nation, none of which is consistent with the needs of the DoD. And so that's one of the reasons why the DoD includes terms from the Common Core ontologies, because to build an ontology you need to put all the terms that you need to define the terms lower down somewhere in the ontology. You have to have them in ontology form. And the Common Core ontology is a suite of ontologies designed precisely to cover gaps like the ones that we find in the DoD dictionary, gaps which come from what we might loosely describe as common knowledge about things like mountains, hills, nations, rivers, seas, and so on. So, how do we deal with terms not in Webster's? Well, the term level of war, which means operational, strategic, or tactical, is a term used in the DoD dictionary, but it's not defined. And situational awareness. Space situational awareness is defined. These terms are not defined, and so they're not in the Joint Dictionary. But they are used. And these were the projects that we were working with when this was being put together, which had a real need for these terms. So this project was a term which was a project about cyber situational awareness. Okay, So the solution to the missing terms problem is the common core ontologies. That we already had the common core ontologies, and we can extend them easily by just put missing terms in the common core. And so we put in missing terms like act of training or act of military force in order to have children where needed, according to the definitions provided in the Joint Dictionary. And these are the common core ontologies in dark blue, and then the extension ontologies in light blue. And this is an example of how the common core works. So the common core has intentional act, and a child of that is active artifact processing, and then a joint publication term is integration, when you integrate an artifact into the system, and that is a child of active artifact processing. These are this slide is very old, so there are many more of the doctrine terms. So each doctrine term is introduced in some doctrine pub. So some of the terms are introduced already in publication number 1, but some of them are introduced in publications lower down. We have ingested terms from nearly all the joint pubs lower down into the Joint Doctrine Ontology. But there are some pubs where we have not ingested all of the terms in those pubs. So we've ingested some of the terms. We've ingested all of the terms for many of them, but for some of them we've only ingested a few, and for a very few we've not ingested any terms as yet. So I think now we're up to about 80% of the total. All right. So when do we add terms into the common core ontology when they're missing from the joint dictionary but used in the joint pubs? Well, first of all, we have the rule that there have to be multiple joint publication terms which use that missing term. And secondly, that adding a new term will clarify the existing terms. Thirdly, that it will provide an improved hierarchy, because the Joint Doctrine Ontology needs to be hierarchical, and there needs to be good child-parent relations to enable good definitions and so forth. And thirdly, that it fills a useful gap in the Common Core Ontology, because the Common Core Ontology may already have a term which corresponds to that. Then also we may need to add a shadow term where a single term in the Joint Dictionary is already there in the Joint Dictionary, but we need terms to correspond to the separate numbered definitions within the Joint Dictionary. So an example would be situational awareness. So this is the joint definition: cognizance of the requisite current and predictive knowledge of the environment upon which operations depend. And then we have a subtype. Now the subtype is easy. Space situational awareness is just situational awareness for a space operation. We can do the same thing for strength superiority. So strength superiority is defined here, and then there are subtypes: space superiority, information superiority, and so forth. We can do the same thing for a planning directive, which is a kind of order. And in this way, we can use the ontology to do things with the joint dictionary, and therefore also with the content of joint doctrine, which we couldn't do before. For instance, we have lots of documents describing battles, describing plans, describing directives, describing events leading up to battles, describing environments where battles might take place. And some of those documents will be using joint doctrine terms, particularly the official ones, which will be using joint doctrine terms all over the place. Now, currently, because we don't have a hierarchy logically defined for the joint doctrine dictionary, if we go searching for some parent term, say cyberspace superiority, say superiority or strength superiority. We may want to know all references to strength superiority in this corpus of documents. We don't know that cyberspace superiority is a child of strength superiority, and so we'll miss all references to strength superiority which appear in this form because the dictionary can't think. The ontology can think. That means we can find, if we need to find all occurrences of strength superiority in all of these documents, we don't want to find only those which use the exact string. We also want to find those which are children in the ontology and grandchildren and so on. So this enables more refined web-based searches. But similarly, it can be used by the same means to facilitate greater coordination, for instance, when you're doing training or when you're doing planning, because we can use exactly the same search principle. We have plans being built over here, plans being built over here. If the joint doctrine ontology is used to tag the terms used in those plans, then we can put sentences from those plans together and check the consistency of that plan. And then we get thereby increased automation of things like plan specification, assessment of operations and so forth. And we can allow entirely new sorts of assessment. We can use the ontology as part of a framework for testing the degree to which given plans are conformant to doctrine. And so far, people are doing that, but they're doing it as human beings intuitively. There isn't software which will test that computation. And also we can identify places where changes in doctrine may be needed. So if everybody is ignoring this particular part of doctrine, we can flag that and then start thinking about whether that part of doctrine might not need to be fixed because no one's using it. Maybe there's something wrong with it. And that's what we'll be talking about later on. All right, but now also the joint doctrine can help joint doctrine. The joint doctrine ontology can help the authors of doctrine. You can use the ontology to visualize the logical structure of a doctrine, for instance. You can use the ontology to trace dependencies between definitions and thereby capture circularities. You can also, if you make a change in one doctrine, you can see which other doctrines depend upon that term, and so you can check whether those doctrines need to be changed in light of the change logically that you just made in this doctrine. And if you have 88 doctrines, all of them using 2,800 technical terms in specific ways, it's useful to have a way of tracking dependencies of that nature, leaving aside dependencies between joint doctrine and army doctrine, NATO doctrine, and so on, where it could also be of a system. So these are the dependencies of the term tactical control. So the term tactical control is used in the definition of force, which is used in the definition of weapon system. So if you change the definition of tactical control, you need to check that that doesn't affect the way you're using the term weapon system, because its definition rests indirectly on the definition of tactical control. Similarly with equipment and so forth, and defense message system and Department of Defense civilian kind of person, and inactive duty training, and the whole thing. These are all the dependencies in joint pub number 1. Before we built the ontology, you couldn't see that. But now we can use it to enable the tracking of issues in the definitions themselves. So there is the definition of component, one of the subordinate organizations that constitute a joint force. You can see that there is a certain kind of circularity here, because constitute is really just compose, and compose is the same as component. But leaving that aside, there are organizations which exist outside the joint force. And this doesn't tell us how we deal with organizations that are outside the joint force, but which these subordinate organizations relate to. And it will help us to recognize types of errors. So in the definition writing guide, which is a document which officially constrains the people who are writing definitions for the Joint Dictionary, rules are specified. Definitions should not be over-restrictive. I've mentioned that they shouldn't be circular. The definition should be positive, so you should state what the thing is, not what it's not. And a definition should contain no hidden definitions, that is to say, definitions embedded inside other definitions. These are 4 different kinds of errors. U means unclear, N means not concise, C means circular, and H means contains hidden definitions. So this definition makes 3 of those errors. This definition only makes 1, so it's circular. This definition makes 2, it's both circular and it's not concise. So the hidden definition here is in the parentheses. Not concise here, you can make this much shorter. So you don't need an overarching term compromising. Also, it's not clear as the first error. So an operational area is not really a term. That's a mistake. And the circularity here, a contingency operation contains, it's a military operation that becomes a contingency operation. So that's a straightforward circularity. The circularity here is flowing from the fact that, again, we're using subordinate command to define subordinate command. So as I say, when a definition is revised, then we can use the Joint Doctrine Ontology to maintain consistency by telling us which other definitions we have to check. And now we can also point to potential benefits of Joint Doctrine Ontology to doctrine users. You'll be able to find doctrinal knowledge more easily because of the search capacity. It will enable providing for each term in the DoD dictionary its own web page, which you can use to provide a repository of examples of use and so forth, which is what we did in the biology case. It can serve as the basis for a future joint doctrine for military IT.